Okay, so when you hear the word Tong, it probably brings a certain picture to mind, right? Maybe uh, secret meetings, Chinatown back alleys.
That's the common image, definitely. And while the word itself in Chinese just means hall or gathering place, the actual story of these groups, mostly among Chinese immigrants in the US, but elsewhere too, is much, much more complicated than that.
Right. And I think the key thing we need to get across right at the start is this kind of duality. You have this perception often linked to crime, especially in, say, the 90s.
Absolutely. But at the same time, these were often the very organizations holding early Chinese communities together. They were providing lifelines, things like immigrant counseling, setting up schools for kids to learn Chinese, even English classes.
So support systems, but also this darker side, or at least this association with crime.
Exactly. It's that mixed mutual aid rubbing up against sometimes illegal activities. And that's what we really want to unpack in this deep dive, looking at the sources we have.
Okay, let's do it. Where do we even start? The origins sound like they go way back.
They do. Our sources point back to 1644 in China. It's tied to the overthrow of the Ming dynasty by the king. That's a huge historical event.
Wow, okay, so not something that just sprang up in America.
Not at all. A really early example is the Qigong or Tang. This was basically a secret society. Its goal, restore the Ming dynasty.
A political aim then?
Initially, yes. And crucially, it was based in Guangdong province. Think about it. That's where so many of the first Chinese migrants to the U.S. came from. They brought this idea, this model of the Tong with them.
So it was an imported concept, rooted in Chinese history. And was the Qigong Tong like a one-off or part of a bigger trend?
Oh, definitely part of a bigger picture. This fits into a whole pattern of secret societies in southern China. You had groups like the Tiandi Hui and others known as Hui, Hongmen, triads.
Dryads, okay, that's a name people might recognize.
Right. And often these groups had overlapping memberships, shared roots, similar structures. It was a common way of organizing. We even see something similar earlier, after the 17th century, when Chinese from Fujian and Canton migrated to Southeast Asia and Taiwan. They formed these powerful merchant groups, setting a kind of precedent for how overseas Chinese communities would organize.
Okay, fast forward a bit. The sources mention a big jump in Chinese immigration by the mid-1800s. U.S., Canada, Australia.
Huh.
Things changed.
Yeah, a significant shift happened then. The sources don't detail all the reasons why, but the numbers definitely went up.
And there's this interesting, maybe slightly legendary figure mentioned, Yang King, a former military commander from the Taiping Heavenly Kingdom.
Right. The Taiping Rebellion was this massive civil war in China. The story goes that after they were defeated, this commander, Yang King, allegedly made his way to the U.S., to Los Angeles.
And started a secret society there.
That's the claim. It's fascinating to think about a veteran of that huge conflict potentially bringing those organizational traditions across the Pacific. But, the source does say alleged, so we should keep that little grain of salt.
Understood. So you have these historical roots, maybe some key individuals, then Chinese workers arrive, California gold rush era and after, and they face, well, a tough time.
A really tough time. Hostility, discrimination, fierce competition for jobs because they were often paid less. It was a very difficult environment.
Which led them to move, right?
Exactly. A lot moved eastward. New York, Philadelphia, Boston, the cities that still have major Chinatowns today, those communities started then and grew with later waves of immigrants.
And in those early days, facing hardship, they started forming their own support groups, these benevolent associations.
Yes, and this is that crucial positive side we talked about. These were absolutely vital. People would group together based on where they came from back in China, maybe their family name, even the dialect they spoke, like Hakka, or sometimes through sworn brotherhoods.
What did they actually do for people?
Practical things. Helping newcomers find work, find a place to stay. They also acted like informal courts, settling disputes within the community, providing some stability.
But it sounds like just running on goodwill wasn't always enough. Financially, things got tough.
Yeah, that seems to be a critical turning point. Many of these purely voluntary groups struggled to make ends meet. The sources suggest some just folded.
And others?
And others, well, they turned to other ways to get funds. Things like running gambling houses or getting involved in prostitution, activities that could bring in money even if they were illegal.
And that's where the image starts to change, where Tong gets that negative spin.
That's exactly it. This is when the term starts picking up those criminal connotations that have stuck with it for so long.
It's also interesting that the source notes gambling wasn't illegal in China itself at the time.
Right. A huge point. What was maybe seen as a social activity back home was criminalized in North America. This created an opening, a niche, for these groups to operate outside the law.
Who typically joined these tongs then? Was it everyone?
The sources suggest they often attracted younger men. Maybe some already had a bit of a criminal background, or perhaps there were people who didn't quite fit into the established family clan or regional associations. Outsiders, maybe?
And then there's the massive gender imbalance in the community.
A huge factor. Because of really restrictive laws like the Chinese Exclusion Act in the US from 1882 or Canada's similar act in 1923, the early Chinese populations were overwhelmingly male.
Which had some pretty terrible consequences, didn't it?
Profoundly tragic ones. The Tongs got heavily involved in bringing women over from China. Some for marriage, yes, but many, many women were brought over for prostitution, often against their will. Exploitation was rampant.
And this fed into conflict, the Tong Wars.
Directly. These wars, mostly late 19th, early 20th century, were incredibly violent. The sources mention the Hipsing Tong and the Onlian Tong as major rivals.
What were they fighting over?
Control. Control of territory, control of those illicit businesses like gambling and brothels, and control over the women they'd brought over. It was also about business rivalries, sometimes assassinations. It got brutal.
The sources mention hatchet men.
Yes, the Bu Hao Doi, sometimes called highbinders. Basically, hired muscle, assassins used in these street fights. It paints a really grim picture of that period. And remember, the very first U.S. Tongs started in San Francisco, explicitly because of the hostility immigrants faced there.
So it's this constant tension. They offered protection from outside hostility.
Or at least that was part of the narrative, part of the appeal, perhaps.
But was that protection also a way to gain control within the community, maybe for these less than legal activities?
That's the really tricky question, isn't it? Where does protection end and control, or even exploitation, begin? The line gets incredibly blurry.
Is there an example of that?
Yeah, the sources mention the plague outbreak in San Francisco's Chinatown around 1900. The established leadership, the Chinese 6 companies, recommended people get vaccinated.
Sensible public health advice.
You'd think so. But many residents were skeptical, didn't trust it. And some Tongs apparently threatened people who did get vaccinated and even threatened the leaders promoting it.
Wow. So it wasn't just about protecting from outsiders, but also about asserting their own authority inside the community, even against public health measures.
It suggests a complex power dynamic, yeah. A resistance to external authority, and maybe internal rivals too, that went beyond just simple community protection. They were building their own kind of order.
Okay. Now, the sources also draw parallels between these American Tongs and the triads in places like Hong Kong.
Right, and that goes back to those shared roots we talked about, the secret societies in southern China, the sworn brotherhood traditions.
How are they similar?
Things like initiation ceremonies, the gods or deities they revered. Lots of overlap, pointing to that common origin. Even the triads in British colonies, while they were also self-help groups, often had that added political goal, overthrowing the Qing dynasty. Again, that mix of community support and sometimes bigger political or criminal aims.
Did the Tongs have a formal structure? It wasn't just random, was it?
No, not usually. The sources describe a pretty standard setup. A president, vice president, secretary, treasurer, auditor, even elders and people specifically for public relations.
So like a proper organization.
Exactly. Suggests a level of administration. And today, their stated primary goals are usually about caring for their members and the community, which brings us back, full circle, to that original benevolent idea.
The sources list some specific names too. Bing Kong Tong, Hip Sing Tong, Onliang Tong.
Sui Sing Tong, Hop Sing Tong.
Yeah. These are real organizations, some still around, with branches across California, Washington, New York, other states, even up into Canada. They weren't just isolated little groups, they were significant networks.
So as we kind of pull this together, it's really clear that just saying Tongs equals crime is way too simplistic.
Completely. They are so much more deeply woven into the history of Chinese immigration. Yes, there's the criminal element that gets a lot of attention, but you absolutely cannot ignore their role as foundational support structures, providing vital help, community cohesion, especially in those early, difficult years.
Precisely. They were these complex, sometimes controversial, but undeniably important pillars in those communities, reflecting the challenges immigrants faced, their resilience, and those deep roots in Chinese social traditions.
Which leaves you thinking, doesn't it? Given all that complexity of the good, the bad, the historical shifts, how do these organizations really fit into the bigger story of immigration, of how people
Right.
build new identities in new places?
hmm And despite that persistent association with crime, you have to wonder what parts of that original idea, the mutual support, the community care, might still be active or resonate within those communities today. It's definitely something worth pondering.